I grew up with my first prime minister that I remember was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And so to me, the idea that women didn't get involved in or couldn't do foreign policy or international affairs or couldn't engage was alien.
You've had a very accomplished and an eventful academic journey. Can you sort of please make us walk through that journey of yours and maybe a little bit tell us what were your motivations in the early days as a young student that drove you to pursue this field and make a mark for yourself?
So, as a historian, one of the things that you're often taught is, you pick up a book and you always go and see the first thing you look at is when was it written? Because origins and context of when those books are written matter. And so I think human beings are a similar way. We are, in some ways, a product of the context in which we grew up, in which we exist, in our location, etc. And that was true for me as well. I grew up in 1980s Delhi, where India was going through a lot. But also that 80s, 90s period meant that I saw many transitions globally, whether it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, India's key foreign policy partner, whether that was the first Gulf War, which affected India in many ways, including in terms of resulting in a balance of payments crisis, but also a transition with those things contributing to change in India itself, as your view listeners would know, which is India opening up economically. So I remember the India before it opened up, before we there was easier access to global TV, to mobile phones. To kind of a very different India where our kind of one TV channel was Doordarshan. And I say that because it tells you kind of I've seen the transition, but also how India's dealing with the world changed over this time. So the curiosity in me in the 80s kind of stayed with me forever, which was seeing all these changes in the world. It was almost you didn't even have to read fiction. It was happening in the world, it was happening in India, and it was happening in India's relations with the world. And I was just curious about why were these things happening. And so part of it was just figuring out these connections. My favorite TV show on that one channel, Doordarshan, was The World This Week, which was showed every Friday evening. And the nerd that I was, that was my favorite TV show. I used to read the magazines that we did get. And so, again, this was all about me just wanting to know, and the curiosity of how global developments were shaping the choices I just personally, forget India as a country, I personally had access to as those developments affected India and India's choices in the world changed. So, for me, my interest in international affairs, I think, partly came from the times I lived in, where you did see a lot of developments at home, abroad, in the region taking place.
So if I talk about those institutional mechanisms where there has been sort of a this entire setting has been institutionalized where women centric sort of engagement in terms of following or shaping the relations between the two countries have begun to at least spur out. Do you think there is a need for more sort of these institutional mechanisms between countries, especially for the countries in the global south and the global north, to have these sort of institutional mechanisms where they specifically focus on leveraging the potential of women to deepen those ties between the two countries?
I think in some ways this effort has to be both top down in the institutional sense, but also bottom up. So I think it can't just be about institutions because many people will not have access to those institutions. They will include some and exclude others. So I think institutions are important, or these kind of initiatives are important in raising the consciousness and the profile, bringing leaders in the countries to the table, perhaps serving as platforms to mentor, places for exchanging. For the example you gave on the India US side, you can have discussions about different experiences in different countries, sharing what has worked and what has not. But at the end of the day, I think it also has to involve more than institutions. It has to involve changes in culture. changes in, and kind of everyday changes in how we approach the idea of women in the kind of in this space, whether that is on panel discussions, whether that is in a conference room, whether that is even thinking about women's research, and for example ensuring that we cite women's work more often. So it's kind of these everyday choices and behaviors that also have to change. I think institutions can play a role, and they're to be encouraged, but I don't think institutions alone can be the answer to ensuring that women's voices have more representation. And I think this is a task that has to be done by women themselves, but also importantly by men in role as mentors, employers, leaders, but also in terms of allies and colleagues and friends as well.
Presently, you are settled in US right now, but you come from India, and while being there also you saw India away from India. So have you seen like the perception of India change over the years? Like, what in your experience has that change been? Is it being for the good? Like, how does the West see India right now?
So, I'm not going to, as much as I have problems with the term global south, I have problems with the term West. I think it depends on who you ask, for instance. I do think the perception has changed. And I think that's because India's capabilities have changed. I think see more continuity in India's approach to the world in some ways. Though you do see some changes with the present government, for example, in the kind of, you could say, much more forward leaning in some areas, including in the partnership with the US. But I think the broad contours of India's foreign policy approach in the world, you've actually seen quite a bit of consistency. I think where you've seen kind of change in terms of the how the world has seen India is, I think, a lot thanks to capabilities. And yes, leadership matters. So the kind of narrative, etc., that leaders take, the role that they decide to play in the world matters. But at the end of the day, the thing that has struck me most from seeing India essentially not being in terms of in the early 2000s, not really being on people's radar, other than the fact that it had, tested nuclear, had the nuclear tests, and so that had brought it upon the world. But what I really saw, I mean, even in the US, but even from when, as I said, at the beginning, I remember in India that went through through its own financial crisis, could barely pay its own bills, right? And so that was the early 1990s. But even by kind of the 2000s, you saw that as India's economy grew, as it became more military and therefore had the ability to become more militarily capable, um, and was kind of saying to the world, look, I am not going to be think of myself as isolated, as self-sufficient, as taking a 1970s 80s approach to the world, and actually thinking, not fearing as much what will the world do to me, but thinking what can the world do for me. I think those changes, the capabilities, and that different perception of not fearing the world, but seeing or thinking about the vulnerabilities that global exposure offered, but the opportunities it did, those are the changes I think led to a change in global perceptions of India. But I see a lot of focus on narrative, that if you say loud enough that India has arrived, people will believe it. I think it's not so much that narrative, it's the substance. And so to me, one thing I have seen in this, there's a lot of international relations theory on this, but I've seen it myself, which is the view of India change as India's capabilities have grown. And there is no substitute for that. And so partnerships can actually help build those capabilities, but those capabilities, in fact, will lead to more choices for India, even in terms of those partnerships. So I think you've seen it change, and to me, kind of, you've seen it change over time. So it hasn't been that suddenly India's, the view of India changed this year, the previous year. I've seen a gradual shift, particularly from the early 1990s, but even in the 2000s. And I'll just give you one example of also not just how much attention, but how it's become a more greater priority, including the US. At the State Department, when I was first in DC, there were maybe two or three people on the India desk. There are now over a dozen. So that priority changes process. It changes. So perceptions change priorities. Priorities change process, and it also personalities play a role in this. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to people's perceptions of what is India able to do, not just what India is willing to do.